24-10 Pats. Go Pats. We got a full complement of receivers in the... All right, sorry I mentioned it. Good grief. All right. So it has been a long time, but we've been talking about a dude. Elijah. Good. It's been a long time. Let's see, last week Pastor Carl preached. The week before that, actually no, just like nobody was here. And the week before that, Pastor Carl preached. And the week before that, we did Elijah. So, yeah, we had like hardcore trivia that night. So it has been a while since we have been to Elijah. Now, if you'll remember, we're in 1 Kings. We start in 1 Kings chapter 17. We first meet Elijah. Elijah kind of pops onto the scene, and he goes up to the king whose name is Ahab. And he tells Ahab, Ahab, you're a wicked, rotten scoundrel. You're a sinner. You're destroying our kingdom. It's not going to rain again until I say it's going to rain again, and I'm not going to say it's going to rain again until God tells me to tell you that. And then Elijah hightails it out because, giving the king that kind of news is not always received well. And so he goes running over and he goes to the brook where? Cherith. Hey. And he eats what? McRaven. Somebody actually gave that as an actual answer to a trivia question. The ravens brought him food. We don't know that he was actually eating ravens. Probably they weren't bringing him themselves, but they were carrying food. So we call it McRaven. Just like when you go to McDonald's, you don't eat McDonald, because that would be disturbing. And so, we had McRaven's bringing him food, and he had drank water. But then all of a sudden one day he got up and the brook was dry. And so God said, now I want you to go to another place. Do you remember where he was going? Zarephath. Sweet. And God said, I've commanded a widow lady there to take care of you. Yeah, up one view. He said, I've commanded a widow lady to take care of you there. And what was the widow lady's name? Widow lady, because we're not told. And so Elijah goes to Zarephath, and he goes to the widow lady, and he stretched the flour and oil a little bit, a couple years anyway, one bin of flour, one bottle of oil, and it just kept going and going, going. It was like the Energizer meal. It just kept going and going and going. And after a little while, something tragic happened to the widow lady. Her son died. And Elijah got a little upset about that when he said, Lord, this lady is taking care of me, and you're going to repay her by killing her son? Lord, I don't think it's fair. And so God says, okay, we'll do something about it. And Elijah says, okay, I will. And he raised the boy back to life. That's pretty cool. And it really didn't go down quite like that, but you understand the broad strokes, right? And so this happens. And then God says, okay, Elijah, we're getting near time. You need to go talk to Ahab again. And so Elijah leaves Zarephath, and he starts heading toward Jerusalem where the king lives, and he bumps into a guy. It wasn't Oman. Obadiah, very good. Oman isn't far off. You guys are good. So he bumps into Obadiah, and Obadiah works for the king, but Obadiah has been secretly stashing and supplying some of the prophets of God out of the king's treasury, which the king didn't know about, which is why Obadiah still had a pulse. And so he gets there, and he says, no, Obadiah, I need to talk to Ahab. And Obadiah's like, yeah, right. You've been hiding from Ahab. I've been looking for you for years. If I go to see Ahab, when I come back, you're going to be gone, and I'm going to be gone. And he's like, no, I'll wait right here. And so he goes to get Ahab, and Ahab goes, hey, you're a troublemaker. And Elijah, of course, says, no, you're the troublemaker. He said, I want you to assemble the nation. I want you to assemble all your priests, and we're going to have a throwdown over here on Mount Carmel. And so they get everybody together on Mount Carmel, and there's a big throwdown. He's like, they got two altars, they got two bulls, they sacrifice them both. And Elijah says, whoever's God responds by fire, close. Whoever's God responds by fire will say that he is God, and we'll just serve and worship him. And he says, I'm going to give you the advantage. I'll let you pick which altar you want. I'll let you go first. And every advantage to the prophets of Baal. And they get up there, and they go for hours and hours and hours and hours. Finally, Elijah's had enough of boredom, and he begins to taunt them to entertain himself. And he's just like, hey, yell louder. Gods are busy people. And this goes on. And finally, it goes on literally all day long. And finally, Elijah goes, okay, my turn. He builds the altar. He puts the meat on it. He goes, but this is too easy. Why don't you get me some water, which in the middle of a drought is like, yeah, okay, after 3 years, no rain, like what water they do have is very secured. But he's like, bring me a bunch of water. And so they douse the altar with water. And he's dug a trench, and it fills the trench. He goes, that's not enough. Do it again. And that's still not enough. Do it again. Because he wants to make sure they get the point that God is God. And so they do all this. Elijah, just a real short, simple prayer. They've been praying and carrying on for hours. He gets up there in 30 seconds, says, okay, God, your turn. And God says, okay, my turn. And all of a sudden, the sacrifice is gone, the wood is gone, the rocks are gone, the water is gone, and the sand is gone, and there's just a big glass hole in the desert. And everybody goes, maybe God is God after all. And Elijah's like, yes, he is. Now, see those prophets of Baal, don't let them escape. Bring them out here. We're going to deal with them today. And so 450 head rolls later, Elijah was the victor. And he sends Ahab home, and he says, look, it's getting ready to rain. You should probably head home. And Elijah goes further up Mount Carmel, and he begins to pray. And he tells his servant, you go look and let me know when you see a cloud, because once a cloud forms, we need to head home ourselves. And so 7 times this goes on. Finally, Elijah's servant comes back and said, I see a cloud the size of what? Remember this? A man's hand. That's not a very big cloud. We said, I got a cloud. And Elijah's like, all right, we're out of here. And so Elijah begins running. And you remember that Ahab had a head start, and Ahab had a chariot that was pulled by horses. And who got there first? Elijah, because he used the passing lane and just ran right by him. And so he got to Jerusalem first, and it was a downpour. And that brings us to where we are, and that would be in 1 Kings chapter 19. That was 2 whole chapters. Like, whew. Whew. All right, let's go home. No, I'm kidding. So 1 Kings chapter 19. Now, this has just been like Elijah prime time for a while now. Elijah's like this hardcore prophet. You've got to be to do what he's done so far. And we get to 1 Kings chapter 19, and we find that Ahab has gotten home, and he has told his wife all of the details. So it starts off, and Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done. Also, how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. Now, what does that tell you about where Jezebel was for this throwdown at Mount Carmel? She wasn't there. She didn't care. Okay? So Jezebel had not been there. You had 450 prophets of Baal had died, but her pet god wasn't Baal, it was Asherah, and she still had her 400 prophets, so she was good. And so, you have this going on, and Ahab is just beside himself. And as every good manly king would do, he runs home to tell his wife all about it. That's a joke. Probably if I had a bad day at the office, I would go home and tell my wife about it too. So verse 2. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, so let the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And Jezebel's like, fine, that's enough. I'm tired of you whining and crying about this guy Elijah. I'm going to take care of it. And so she sends a messenger to Elijah saying, Elijah, let the gods kill me if I don't kill you by tomorrow. Now, this isn't going to work out so well, but this is her threat. This is her promise. And so she has decided that Elijah has worn out his welcome and that he is going to do this. Now, what's interesting to see is Elijah's response. Elijah, who just beheaded 450 prophets of Baal. Elijah, who just called down fire from heaven. Elijah, who just called down rain from heaven. Elijah, who has raised a person from the dead. Elijah, who has eaten McRaven. Elijah, who has done all of this stuff. Guess what he does when he hears this threat? He runs. And it sounds out of character for Elijah. But there is a detail here that you must understand. Elijah was what nationality? He was a Jew, right? He was Jewish. Ahab was the king of Israel, making him Jewish. Jezebel was not Jewish. Okay, that's an important detail because the kings of Israel had always granted the prophets of God immunity. They understood that the prophets were messengers from God. And even in times like Ahab, where they didn't specifically worship God and they didn't specifically recognize God, the tradition that had grown up was hands off the prophets. Because in order for a prophet to do his job, if he's a messenger of God and has to give bad news to the king, the prophet needs immunity in order to give bad news to the king. And so in Israel, there had always been this custom of immunity where a prophet could, and did many times up to this point, go to a king and say, "You're doing it wrong. God said, fix it, or I'm going to fix you." And this is just part of what the prophet had to do, but they needed immunity in order to be able to deliver that message. And so in Ahab's mind, up until this point, it's getting ready to change in history, and it begins to become less immune. But up until this point in time, the prophets enjoyed immunity in the face of the Jewish king, to the place where they could deliver bad news, sad news, hard news, and the king was custom-bound, tradition-bound, honor-bound, culturally bound to not do anything about it. And so Ahab could be as angry as he wanted to be at Elijah, and Elijah didn't have to be very concerned. Jezebel was not a Jew. Jezebel was not bound by this code. And as soon as Jezebel decided, look, I'm going to kill you, it became a genuine threat for Elijah because he no longer had immunity with Jezebel. And so the fact that he ran, while it seems out of character from everything that we've seen up to this point, was really not that odd when you think about this whole immunity deal. And there's a little bit more to it, and we'll keep going, and we'll get there. And so this is her threat. And verse 3, "And when he saw that, he arose and he ran for his life and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there." And so up until this point, he's had a servant with him, a companion that's there to help him, and he leaves him behind, and he keeps on running. That's kind of a significant act on his part. What we're beginning to see is there is some discouragement setting in, and one of the things that we do when we get sad or we get discouraged or we get angry is we begin to isolate ourselves from other people. You ever been there? Nobody's ever done that, right? Yeah, that's a rhetorical question. We do that. And so he does that. And so he leaves his servant there. Verse 4, "He himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and he came and he sat down under a broom tree." That's the kind of tree you sweep with. Thank you for the one person who left. "And he prayed that he might die. And he said, 'It is enough now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers.'" Now here's a good question for you. Why pray that prayer? You think about it. Do you really need to pray for God to kill you? If he wanted to die, all he had to do was stop running. Jezebel would have gladly taken care of this for him. And so, this is not the most logical prayer you could pray at any point. When somebody is threatening your life and you say, "Okay, God, take me," and God's like, "Just stand still, dude. It'll happen." And so this is kind of, it's an ironic prayer that Elijah prays here. "Lord, take my life. I'm no better than my fathers, and they're all dead, so I may as well be dead too." Yeah, it doesn't really make tremendous sense, but there you have it. And verse 5, "Then as he lay and slept under a broom tree, suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, 'Arise and eat.' Then he looked, and there by his head was a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again." Now you think about it here for a second. This is kind of maybe an odd thing. Elijah takes a nap. Elijah eats a meal. This is mundane details. I take a nap, and I don't blog about it. I eat. Everybody knows I've eaten. Occasionally I'll post it on Facebook if it was a really good meal, but I don't blog about it. And so it seems like an almost mundane detail here that Elijah here is taking a nap and he's eating a meal. Bigger, though, than all of this, what we really see in Elijah is he's going through this very discouraged kind of phase. That he seems, you almost get the impression as you read this, that the guy is exhausted and that he is now isolated because he's left his servant behind, that he's sitting here and he's just almost like facing this funk, but almost to the point of being depressed. And you're like, what gives? Why would Elijah be discouraged? And the simple answer is he was exhausted. I mean, you think about all that we have just read. A lot of that was just in the last couple of days for Elijah's time. You figure a day-long religious competition about who's going to, have fire come out of heaven, followed by a very public execution, which was kind of lengthy given the volume he had to deal with. And you get that followed by this very intense prayer session. And you have that followed by a marathon-like run from Mount Carmel to Jerusalem, followed by this threat, and now I'm on the run again. The dude was exhausted. I mean, all of that within the space of 2 days, it would leave us at the end of our rope. And that's exactly what happened to Elijah. And so God, rather than telling Elijah to cheer up, doesn't tell him anything at all. What does he do? He makes sure that he gets some sleep. And he makes sure that he gets some food. And so he deals with his discouragement. His discouragement is more physically motivated than spiritual. And so he deals with his discouragement by making sure that he's getting some sleep and that he's getting some food. And so he's taking care of those physical elements that Elijah is dealing with. And we find in verse 7, after he goes and he lays down again. And the angel of the Lord came back the second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." So he arose and he ate, and he went in the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. And so a second time, God comes to him and he says, look, get some sleep, here's some more sleep, here's some more food. And he again deals with the physical need that he has. And he's making sure that not only is his body strengthened from what has just happened, but he is making sure that his body is strengthened for what's getting ready to happen, because now he's got a lengthy, difficult journey in front of him. And so God makes sure that he has the resources that he needs to do that. And then he says, now I want you to go to Mount Horeb. I've taken care of your physical needs. I'm going to send you to Mount Horeb where I can take care of your spiritual needs. Because it was at Mount Horeb that he is going to have a renewed encounter and a renewed revelation from God. And so in the sleeping and the eating, his body is renewed and it's restored. And as he gets to Mount Horeb, his spirit is going to be renewed and restored. And what we find in this, and kind of like the point of this whole segment, because this is kind of like the lull between a couple big things, is that God created us and he knows us pretty well. That's a good thing. There are times when all the time, our physical and our spiritual selves are connected. And we sometimes miss that idea, that our physical self and our spiritual self would be connected, and something that could happen in your physical body, in your physical existence, could actually negatively impact your spiritual existence. Here's the easiest way to sense this sometime. Here's what I want you to do. This is homework, right? Don't really go do this, but you could imagine this. If you went and you didn't go to bed at all tonight, now for some of you that's not a stretch, I realize, but go home, don't go to bed, hang out, party, do whatever you're going to do, and then tomorrow at about 11 o'clock in the morning, I want you to pray. Get into a dark room and pray for about a half hour. What's going to happen? I said, don't really do this. This is an exercise in Barney-esque, use your imagination.
Still do it though?
Huh?
Still do it?
Yeah, but don't tell your teachers I told you. Because if you skip school, I am not signing your absentee note. No, but this is theoretical. And what would happen, do you think, tomorrow at 11 o'clock when you closed your eyes and began to pray? You fall asleep. So do you have a spiritual problem because you can't pray? No, you have a physical problem. You didn't sleep. And so in a very real way there, you see this connection between our physical existence and our spiritual existence. God created us and understands the correlation, the combination of those two things. And we would do well to remember this as well. There are times that we get discouraged. There are times that things happen in our lives. And there are times that things happen in the lives of people around us. And sometimes we assume that it's a spiritual problem when indeed it might be a physical problem. Or we assume it might be that it's a physical problem, but it actually might be a spiritual problem. That's a two-way street. And so here's God looking at Elijah, being discouraged, almost being depressed, and he realizes it's not a spiritual problem. It's not that he doesn't pray enough. It's certainly not that he doesn't have faith. It's certainly not that he doesn't have a relationship with God. The dude's just exhausted out of his mind. And so he deals with the physical stuff, and then he's going to renew his spiritual stuff as well. And here's the connection that we find, or the point that we find, is that not only are our physical selves and our spiritual selves connected, which is convenient since they're both ourself, that sometimes, in fact, oftentimes, our physical self needs to be tended to before our spiritual self can be. Because if you stayed up all night and then you tried to pray, what I would say to you is you need to learn how to sleep better in order to facilitate your spiritual development. That's not really a spiritual discipline, sleep. And yet, when we don't sleep, it becomes a spiritual impediment. And so, when we're tending to people's needs around us, as we care for ourselves and we care for each other, sometimes we need to be aware that it might just be that somebody needs a meal before they need spiritual advice. And of course, we sometimes get that backwards. I'm reminded of a story I was told that I read. Hudson Taylor was in the 19th century. He was a missionary to mainland China. 19th century, late 19th century, there was a lot of missions work, and England especially was sending out missionaries all over the world. And Hudson Taylor he was trained as a physician, and he went over to China to try to witness to and evangelize native Chinese folks. And so he got there, and he found a culture that was very different than his own. Hudson Taylor did something that by standards in his day, even to some degree standards by our day, was very extreme. He went completely native. Like he adopted a Chinese dress. He learned their language. He shaved his head and grew out his ponytail, the whole thing. Went as native as possible, trying to become as Chinese as possible so that he could reach Chinese people for God. And so he was constantly evangelizing, constantly witnessing, and finally one day, and it was kind of a turning point in his time there. A man came up to him, an elderly man came up to him, and he says, Hudson Taylor, I hear what you're saying, and I don't argue that. He said, I might even accept it if I thought you cared about me as much as you cared about my soul. And he realized that he was so driven to meet people's spiritual needs that he had kind of missed that physical component of people's needs, whether it was relational, whether it was their physical need, whatever it might be. And so the point for us is to remember that our physical and our spiritual are connected, and we need, especially if we're going to meet other people's needs and we're going to truly minister to them, we're probably going to need to meet both, and oftentimes it means meeting their physical need before we have an opportunity to meet their spiritual need, because it creates the opening. But God created us, and He knows us. Those two things are connected, and we need to not forget that. Cool?